He saved me from my ex, then locked me inside his penthouse. Zoe thought the stranger in the black suit was her rescue, until his men took her through a private garage, into an armored car, and up to a silent Paris penthouse, where every door, every hallway, every guard answered to him. Giorgio didn't call it kidnapping. He called it protection. But Zoe knew the truth. She had traded one cage for another, and this one belonged to the Mafia. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Picture Lena, a fragile silhouette in an unforgiving hotel lobby. She only wanted to deliver an old manuscript and retreat to her quiet life. But fate is a cruel director. Instead of peace, she finds her abusive ex standing right in her path. Panicking, she backs into the steel cage of an elevator, begging the tall shadow inside for salvation. Enter Vittorio. The lighting shifts. This man is no savior. He is an apex predator. His hand immediately clamps onto her waist, locking her in place. His dark eyes lock onto the ex, already sizing up a coffin for the boy. The trap snaps shut. It is a harsh reality we all must learn eventually. Sometimes the hand reaching out to pull you from the fire is just a much darker monster claiming you for himself. The ex shrinks back into the lobby, recognizing the silent, deadly violence rolling off Vittorio. Lena lets out a breathy, nervous laugh, desperately trying to break the heavy tension. But Vittorio remains still as stone. The brass doors slide shut with a final thud, and his firm grip on her waist does not loosen a single fraction. Later, watching the hotel staff tremble in terror just speaking to him, the freezing truth hits her. She just traded a pathetic bully for a lethal captor. Her mind fractures, spinning back to the quiet safety of her morning routine, where she had perfectly timed her daily bakery visit down to the minute. It reveals something painfully true about trauma. We obsessively control the tiny details of our lives, purely to block out the massive, terrifying forces we know we cannot fight. Let the camera linger on her morning for a moment. Lena anchors her fragile existence to the most boring routines imaginable. The old man in the gray apron, the heavy smell of baking bread, the heat of a cheap coffee cup. These are the tiny life rafts keeping her from drowning in panic. Constantly, her fingers push a pair of taped, broken glasses up her nose. They are a painful souvenir from a brutal winter back in Philadelphia. She wears those crooked frames like a shield, a silent warning to the world that she is broken goods, far too damaged to bother with. But here is the tragic flaw in wearing your scars on the outside. When you spend years convincing yourself that you are worthless, you completely forget how to fight back the moment a real predator steps out of the dark and decides you belong to him. She calls her miserable apartment a discreet palace. In reality, it is a freezing fourth-floor walk-up. The thin glass rattles against the biting wind, and muffled piano chords bleed through the cheap walls all day. She romanticizes this lonely box because it provides the ultimate illusion of safety. Nobody knows where she sleeps. She crosses the gray city streets, stepping into a dusty, rare bookshop to face her boss, Madame Aureli. Lena has constructed a life totally stripped of human warmth, trading affection for cold predictability. It teaches us a deeply heartbreaking lesson. Far too often, a wounded person will gladly lock themselves inside a freezing, empty room, simply to avoid the terrifying risk of letting someone new break their heart all over again. Her boss is a deeply intimidating woman with sharp white hair, just another force casually stepping on our protagonist. She calls her Zoe, a fragile fake name Lena uses to sever the cord to her past. Madame Aureli tosses a leather folder across the desk, openly mocking her quiet nature. Lena simply takes the hit, offering a hollow joke in return. Her self-worth died the day she locked herself in that attic. The assignment is a hand delivery to a wealthy buyer at the Plaza Hotel. The camera pushes in as sheer panic washes over Lena. She sucks in a trembling breath, eyes going wide with absolute terror. It is a stark reminder that deep trauma never cares about logic. Sometimes, just hearing the name of a glamorous building is enough to make a survivor feel like they are fighting for their life. Watch how her anxiety spirals into a crushing panic. To a broken woman surviving on pennies, A luxury hotel feels like a heavily armed fortress, yet a spark of stubborn pride kicks in. She pastes on a brave face, promising to finish the job before lunch. Madame O'Reilly hands over cab fare with a nasty warning to eat something, because a place like that will swallow a hungry girl whole. Lena takes the cruel jab like a needle between the ribs. She forces her trembling mind away from the fear, focusing entirely on the soft velvet folder and her white cotton gloves. It highlights a powerful defense mechanism. When we are truly terrified, we obsess over the small tasks in front of us, desperately hoping the busy work will drown out the roaring fear inside our heads. Notice how obsessively she prepares for this simple trip. She straightens the old pages with manic precision, trapped in the tragic delusion that organizing a folder will somehow protect her from a violent world. It is only when the taxi forces her to sit still that her buried memories claw to the surface. Dark thoughts of Bastien, her former French fiancé, flood her mind. He is the monster she ran from, the reason she fled across an ocean. Growing up as the son of a powerful lawyer, Bastien was poisoned by endless money and influence. He believed he could consume whatever he wanted without paying a toll. It is a chilling reminder about human darkness. True villains rarely wear monstrous masks. They usually just look like perfectly dressed men who have never been told no in their entire lives. Bastien was a masterclass in breaking a human spirit. He thrived on public humiliation, casually listing her flaws while pouring wine at elegant dinners. He dismantled her world piece by piece, auditing her phone and systematically chasing away her friends. When she finally found the courage to leave, he did not rage. He just laughed, absolutely certain she was a possession that belonged to him forever. The echo of that laugh forced her to sleep with the lights on for 10 straight years. The cab jolts to a stop at the massive stone steps of the plaza. She pushes up her broken glasses, clutching the folder to her chest like a paper shield, and walks blindly into the jaws of a trap. It is a bitter lesson about survival. Escaping the demons of your past is never as simple as just changing your city. Stepping into the lobby, Lena does not see luxury. She sees a lit battlefield. The marble floors amplify every click of her worn heels, making her feel exposed, like a rabbit in an open meadow. The heavy scent of jasmine makes her stomach turn. She prays to drop the package and vanish. But the second the clerk coldly tells her to wait, her reality shatters. Before she even turns her head, the sound hits her like a physical blow. A deep, arrogant laugh rolling from the hallway. Bastien. Her abuser is standing right there, casually sipping a drink. The impossible bad luck of the moment short-circuits her terrified brain. It is a brutally cold reminder about fate. The universe does not care about mathematical odds. When the time comes, your deepest nightmares will always track you down. Stick with me here. You and I are about to witness true terror. Lena freezes completely. She watches Bastien looking comfortably relaxed, which makes the violent chaos exploding in her mind feel much worse. The grand lobby suddenly warps, feeling like a rapidly shrinking box. He is barely 20 meters away. If he turns his head even a fraction, she is dead. She silently prays the mahogany desk will just split open and swallow her. She stops breathing entirely, locked in the exact paralyzing freeze. A deer suffers before the wolf strikes. The clerk is still speaking, but the words are drowned out by the deafening alarms ringing in her ears. It proves a terrifying point about trauma. Sometimes the most inescapable prison in the world is just the space inside your own frozen body. Words mean nothing to her now. Her flips a primal survival switch, turning her into a hunted animal mapping out an escape route. Her eyes frantically scan the room for a hidden stairwell, quickly locking onto a dim hallway with 3 mirrored elevators. It is deeply heartbreaking to see how efficiently abuse trains a person to calculate escape angles in the blink of an eye. She mumbles a hollow thank you to the clerk and moves. Every instinct screams at her to run, but she knows sprinting will only trigger the predator to chase. She slips into the furthest elevator, violently smashing the button, clutching her velvet folder like it could actually stop a bullet. Extreme fear has a twisted, tragic way of forging brilliant survival except out of totally ordinary people. In her panicked mind, Bastion's laugh bounces violently off the walls, creeping closer by the second. She silently screams at the elevator doors to close. But these luxury doors are designed to slide shut at a painfully slow, elegant pace. The delay is pure torture. Hanging in that agonizing weight, her eyes catch a towering shadow in the mirror. A massive man in a sharp, dark suit is standing perfectly still behind her. She had been so focused on the monster outside that she never noticed the silent phantom stepping in with her. Her blood runs entirely cold. The devil she knows is out in the lobby, but an absolute mystery is locked inside this tiny metal box with her. It is a chilling reminder of our vulnerability. Sometimes the quiet unknown lurking behind you is far deadlier than the threat you can see. Her mind captures the stranger in fractured, blurry snapshots. The sharp, violent angle of a jawline, the heavy weight of an expensive watch resting against his wrist. But the most terrifying detail is the dense, suffocating silence he carries into the space. Out in the hallway, the elevator doors are still wide open. After living in a state of constant fear for a decade, sleeping with the lights blazing, true clarity is an absolute luxury. Her shattered nerves force a desperate move. She throws herself backward, slamming against the stranger's solid chest, hoping a public scene will keep Bastion from dragging her back into the dark. Her folder scatters across the floor as she begs for mercy. We see it time and time again. Absolute terror will always force us to trade our basic logic for the slimmest chance at survival. Picture the scene with me as the camera tracks Zoe's frantic sprint down that dimly lit corridor. Her breath tears through the heavy quiet, just before she crashes into Giorgio. He stands there like a monolith, and she uses him as a desperate shield against the creeping shadow of Bastion. Driven entirely by blind panic, she presses a trembling, clumsy kiss against his sharp jaw right as the heavy brass doors begin to slide shut. She completely expects him to shove her away. Instead, his massive calloused hand clamps onto her waist, snapping tight like a heavy steel trap. The metallic click of the elevator perfectly mirrors her terrifying realization. It is a bitter irony of our human experience. In our frantic rush to escape the teeth of a wolf, we often throw ourselves blindly into the waiting jaws of a lion. Notice the effortless brutality of his reaction. Giorgio does not even flinch. He simply glides his arm around her shaking shoulders, dropping his chin to her temple with the terrifying intimacy of a romance that has lasted for decades. A low, liquid murmur of Italian slips from his mouth. Zoe does not understand a single word, but the cadence is perfectly clear. It is the quiet, bone-chilling frequency of a man who orders funerals before his morning coffee. Out in the harsh light of the hallway, Bastion freezes completely. The predatory swagger drains right out of him as he locks eyes with the true apex predator. It is a harsh truth we all have to face eventually. No matter how fierce the neighborhood bully pretends to be, the real monsters of this world always operate in absolute silence. Let us step inside that confined metal space and watch the air turn to lead. Bastion throws both hands up in a hollow, shaking surrender. He plasters a pathetic smile across his face as he backs away from a level of violence he could never comprehend. The heavy brass doors glide shut with a final, sealing click. Her pursuer is gone, but the real nightmare now breathes right beside her. Zoe stands utterly paralyzed, her heartbeat thrashing against her ribs like a dying bird. The silence is thick and suffocating, drowning in the dark scent of aged leather and sandalwood. She desperately sought a shield, but found a cage. It is a chilling reality for us all. The walls we hastily build to keep the danger out are usually the exact same walls that lock us in. The sheer weight of the moment shatters her composure completely. Trapped under the harsh overhead lights, her nervous system short-circuits into a frantic, breathless kind of laughter. She begins to babble in a chaotic blend of 3 different languages. It is the desperate, high-pitched chatter of a soul quietly collapsing in on itself. But when she finally gathers the courage to take a step back, she hits a solid wall of tailored wool and dense muscle. Giorgio does not tighten his grip on her. He does not resort to vulgar, clumsy force. He simply remains completely immovable, projecting the terrifying stillness of a god who has already written her tragic fate. Life teaches us this painful lesson over and over. The most terrifying form of control is never a raised voice, but a quiet, unbreakable silence. The spinning finally stops, leaving her to look upon her captor. The camera lingers on her hyper-focused survival instinct as she catalogues the man holding her hostage. He is somewhere in his 30s, carved from pure stone, with a faint scar whispering of a deeply violent history. His eyes are hollow voids, entirely empty of warmth. Then she notices the wardrobe. A bespoke dark wool suit, finished with a heavy silk family crest on the cuff. She only absorbs this detail because his hand remains an iron shackle against her hip. He speaks in pristine English, asking for her name, with a soft, polite tone, completely devoid of human empathy. We must always remember that true darkness rarely wears a monstrous face. It is usually impeccably dressed, hiding its devastating nature in plain sight. Her voice trembles just once before she forces it completely steady, offering only her first name, Zoe. When he waits in heavy silence for the rest, she bites her tongue. It is a fragile and entirely useless rebellion. Notice the subtle shift in his posture here. He simply tilts his head, a gesture mimicking respect, but actually acting as a cold, clinical measurement of her breaking point. Then, with agonizing slowness, he peels his hand away from her waist. It is a cold display of absolute control, proving he alone dictates when she is allowed to breathe. The elevator chimes. The doors part to reveal a hulking guard and a trembling hotel manager. It is a bitter pill we all must swallow eventually. Small acts of defiance mean absolutely nothing when the entire board is already rigged against you from the start. The camera pulls back to capture a world bending its knee. Hotel manager turns the color of ash, the blood vanishing from his face the exact second his eyes meet the predator. He stammers through pathetic, broken apologies, his hands shaking violently as he breathes the title, Don Castellaneta. Down the long corridor, a room service attendant abandons a silver cart and sprints directly for the fire exit. Even the polished front desk worker hits a silent alarm. The sheer, vibrating dread radiating off these ordinary people is the hammer that finally shatters her denial. Their terror paints the true portrait of her nightmare. It is a haunting truth of survival. Sometimes the raw fear in the eyes of strangers tells us far more about our own doom than our intuition ever could. The tragedy finally locks into place, striking her with the raw force of a derailing train. She is just an academic, yet the cultural markers are simply impossible to ignore. The name Castellaneta, the ancient title of Don, the deep, blood-soaked roots of Sicilian syndicate royalty. Suddenly, her velvet folder of priceless historical manuscripts feels absurdly trivial against the looming shadow of a shallow grave. Her voice breaks as she offers a pathetic whisper, begging for permission to leave. Meanwhile, the towering enforcer drops to one knee, gathering her scattered papers with delicate, chilling precision. It is profoundly disturbing to watch a bone-breaker handle parchment like spun glass. We quickly learn that the things we treasure most become utterly worthless the moment our breath is threatened. Observe the devastating arrogance of absolute power at work. He does not even blink at her desperate plea to escape. It is as if the wind itself had spoken. Instead, he projects his voice down the hallway, commanding the entire floor to be emptied. He seizes a private suite, as though he owns every oxygen inside the building. Without a single downward glance, he instructs his enforcer, Vincenzo, to take her velvet folder. Vincenzo claims her life's work, with the dead-eyed mechanical efficiency of an assassin, loading a weapon. He cares nothing for her passion, only for securing a valuable asset, and just like that, her identity is stolen. It is a deeply unsettling reality that those with true terrifying authority never need to raise a hand to ruin you. They simply command the tide, and the water obeys. You and I have watched this tragic dance unfold before. The desperate thrashing of a trapped soul. My heart aches for her as she scrambles for an invisible exit. She weaves a painfully obvious web of lies about strict laws and misplaced deliveries, desperately clawing at the fading ghost of her normal life. She pulls on the brittle armor of a tough city girl, projecting a hollow bravery while her spirit shatters inside. In a final agonizing plea, she offers to simply evaporate. She promises to take the service stairs, to erase his face from her memory, to vanish from his universe entirely. It is a universal human tragedy. When backed to the very edge of the cliff, we try to negotiate with the hurricane, completely forgetting that the storm has absolutely no interest in our rules. He simply allows her to exhaust herself against the unyielding stone of his silence. He stands perfectly still, absorbing her frantic lies with the chilling patience of a predator letting its tire out right before the fatal strike. When her breath finally hitches, he locks his dead eyes onto hers. She tries to build a fragile shield of logic, arguing that the pathetic stalker downstairs poses no real threat to his empire. But Giorgio effortlessly takes her naive worldview and crushes it into dust. He recites the timeline of her doom with cold, mechanical precision. 2 hours to extract her name. 4 hours to map out every detail of her existence. It is a devastating lesson to learn. Our clever logic and careful plans mean absolutely nothing when standing before someone who owns the entire board. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? He tightens the psychological vice, bleeding the hope right out of the room. With a voice like silk mixed with gravel, he maps out the brutal mathematics of her end. In 6 hours, the stalker sells her to the wolves. In 8, she ceases to exist entirely, unless she accepts his protection. The sick irony hangs heavy. The savior extending a hand is the exact monster she should be sprinting away from. Here lies the tragic birth of the trauma bond. She offers a weak protest, but the words just dissolve. He calculates the precise moment her knees will hit the floor. It is a bitter reality of the human heart and a simple lesson we must carry. Sometimes, our ultimate destroyers wear the comforting mask of our only salvation. We have finally reached the jagged edge of no return. He stares down at her trembling frame with the cold expertise of a man who has broken 1,000 souls. He knows exactly how many heartbeats she has left. Dropping his voice to a dangerous whisper, he reminds her of the fatal truth. She was the one who reached for him. Then, he simply dictates where she will stand. It is in this precise shadow that her mind splinters. Beneath the suffocating terror, a dark, treacherous corner of her psychology thrills at being consumed. She loathes herself for the sensation, weeping as her own biology betrays her. The grandest tragedy of all leaves us with a quiet lesson. The most lethal monsters do not need to build our cages. They merely hand us the iron, and we forge the locks ourselves. Stick with me here, because we need to look closely at Zoe. The camera lingers on her face as her entire life is silently hijacked. The most terrifying part of this frame is the absolute absence of screaming. The capo sits there, playing the megalomaniac to perfection, stealing her freedom without ever raising his voice. He calmly dictates a fabricated story about her being ill. You can physically see Zoe trying to fight back, but the sheer weight of the trauma paralyzes her throat. The room is brutally, suffocatingly quiet, and here is a simple truth we must understand about people like him. It is a lesson about power. The most dangerous predators in this world do not ever need to yell to make you obey. They just speak softly and let your own terror do all the heavy lifting. Look at the heavy shadows in this scene as Zoe asks where they are going. Her voice is nothing more than a shattered, humiliating whisper. She steps into the car simply because a narcissist spent 5 seconds orchestrating her surrender. Giorgio sits beside her, casually checking his expensive watch, as if he is waiting for a train, not kidnapping a woman. He names a location where her boss cannot possibly reach them. It takes a full city block for Zoe to process what he just said, and another block for the pure horror to wash over her face. She never once mentioned her boss's last name, yet Giorgio already knew it. The hard lesson we can take from this is chilling but necessary. Silence will Helens never protect you from the predators who already live comfortably in the dark. Notice the framing of Giorgio sitting there, his hand resting casually on his knee. He stares out at the Paris streets, as if he owns the pavement and every single soul walking on it. Zoe asks no more questions. It is heartbreaking to witness her body language. She regresses into a frightened 15-year-old girl, burying her panic deep inside. Her brain begs her to pack the trauma away, just to survive the ride. The car rolls into a massive underground bunker, and Vincenzo opens her door. It looks like a polite gesture, but it is actually a leash, snapping tight. She follows them into a private elevator that shoots up to his penthouse, as the iron gates slam shut behind them. The life lesson here is undeniable and grim. Politeness from a captor is nothing but a velvet-lined trap. The second those heavy elevator doors slide open, the vast penthouse simply swallows her alive. The acoustics in this space are truly terrifying. It is a suffocating kind of silence where, if you were to scream, the expensive walls would just absorb the sound. Giorgio sheds his coat with a sickeningly normal domestic rhythm, acting as if they are merely a married couple returning home. He points to a bedroom, instructing her to ask Vincenzo for whatever she needs. When she nervously questions what would happen if she tries to sneak out, his face does not shift in anger. He just gives her the cold, infinitely patient stare of a prison warden. The lesson we find here is deeply unsettling. True monsters do not lose their temper. They just calmly promise you a beautiful nightmare. The camera follows Zoe as she walks into her assigned room, perching on the edge of that massive bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. Notice what she refuses to do in this moment. She does not shed a single tear. Crying is a luxury reserved for those who are safe, and she knows there are no locks on her door. Sleep is out of the question tonight. Her nervous system is utterly fried, locked into a harsh survival mode. Instead, she spends her first night listening to the breathing of the house. She times Vincenzo's heavy boots, patrolling the hallway every 40 minutes. By 2 a.m, she maps out every distant sound. The brutal lesson here is clear. When your safety is violently ripped away, your brain will turn your own fear into a weapon, just to keep you breathing. This sequence is painful to watch. It is only the second morning, and the trauma bonding is already sinking its teeth into her mind. She discovers fresh coffee and a handwritten note from him on the counter, warning her not to open the door for anyone. His penmanship is elegant, completely masking the ruthless psychopath underneath. What is her reaction? She carefully folds the note and hides it in her pocket. In this dark moment, that piece of paper is the only physical proof she still exists. It is a bitter truth to accept, but here is the life lesson we must swallow. When a person is pushed to the absolute edge of despair, they will cling to the hand that locked the cage, just to feel a human pulse. That night she cracks her door open, and Vincenzo is already waiting. The shadows lengthen as Vincenzo slowly looks up from his Italian newspaper. He does not offer a single word, because when you hold all the power, shouting is unnecessary. His dead stare communicates everything she needs to know. She can walk out, but he will follow, and Giorgio will know. Defeated, she shuts the door and retreats to her room. She pulls a tiny notebook from her bag. Once used for harmless memories, it has now become her desperate survival manual. She begins charting out the blind spots and hallway lengths. The saddest part of this visual is the lesson it leaves us with. She is not planning a cinematic escape. When the walls close in on us, our very first instinct is rarely to fight. It is usually just learning how to survive inside the corners of the cage. It is day 3, and Vittorio steps into the frame bearing unexpected gifts. You and I need to pause and unpack this psychological trap together. He hands her expensive shopping bags, yet he never orders her to wear the garments. A common thug would simply yell at her to put them on. But Vittorio is playing a masterful game of chess. He casually mentions her own clothes will not last the week, twisting his absolute control to sound like a practical favor. And Luca? She has jeudi isud expression, the way she used to study antique books, reading his moods just to stay safe. The life lesson here is one we all need to remember. When someone truly wants to own your life, the trap never looks like a rusty iron cage. It usually looks exactly like a perfectly tailored safety net. The tension peaks when Luca finally asks when this nightmare will end. Vittorio does not raise his voice. He flatly states that it ends only when he decides it ends. He delivers the line not like a theatrical villain, but like a man reading the morning weather report. Left alone, she opens the bags to find no pretty dresses. Instead, she finds practical, dark clothing designed to let her move quietly. The visual message is painfully clear. She is not a trophy on a shelf. She is a pet learning to survive his penthouse. The cavernous size of the place is driving her mad. She memorizes how the sunlight crawls across the rug just to feel grounded. The lesson here is absolute. You can dress a prison up in imported marble and fine leather, but a cage is still a cage if you cannot leave. Through the lens, you can feel Luca's frantic hypervigilance, crawling right out of the screen. Those towering ceilings reduce her to a ghost, making the massive windows feel like a cruel joke. The opulent library feels as sterile as a hospital waiting room, reeking of harsh cleaners and cold leather. She looks like a discarded coat shoved into the back of a closet. But human beings are incredibly stubborn creatures. Stripped of her freedom, she decides to control the math. She tracks every single movement Vincenzo makes. 40 minutes on the dot, every single time, logged diligently into her notebook. The life lesson here reveals the raw power of the mind. Strip a person of the basic freedom, and their brain will instantly turn pure terror into cold, calculated data just to survive. Notice the subtle shift in her posture as Luca tries to play the game herself. She dials her boss, Madame Aureli, forcing a raspy cough to sell the illusion of a severe flu. Listen to the heavy silence on the line. Aureli is a fiercely sharp woman who instantly recognizes this sick story is complete garbage. She fires back a dark joke about the flu preferring luxury hotels. Yet she avoids pushing for the truth. It is a brutally quiet moment of missed connection. The life lesson here hits right in the chest. We always like to think our clever little lies are protecting the people we care about. But the bitter truth is, those very same lies are usually just the heavy bricks we use to seal ourselves inside our own solitary confinement. The camera holds on Luca's trembling hand. Madame Aureli does not pry. She simply tells Luca to drink water and come back in one piece. It is her quiet way of saying she knows Luca is in deep trouble. Luca hangs up fast before the tears fall. Watch her next move carefully. She refuses to let the maids into her space. She washes her only shirt in the bathroom sink, hanging it over the heated rack. To an outside observer, it seems totally pointless, but it is actually a desperate survival reflex. She has lost her entire world, so she claims ownership of the sink. It is the saddest kind of victory. The lesson here is universally true. Grabbed his shirt. When someone rips away your power over the big things, you will fight to the death to control the tiny things, just to remind yourself you are still human. The lighting shifts as Vittorio shows up, unannounced. You can physically see Luca's heart drop. She sits barefoot on the floor, pretending to read to hide how terrified she actually is. Vincenzo locks down the hallway. Vittorio steps into her space, holding a small box tied with a dark ribbon. He looks exhausted, his suit jacket open, sleeves rolled up as if he just finished burying a body. He whispers a simple good evening. And Luca? She actually fires back, sarcastically calling him by his formal mafia rank. Vittorio just stops and smiles at her foolish defiance, ordering her to open the damn box. Here is the bitter lesson of this sequence. Sarcasm is never true bravery. When we are backed into a dark corner, with zero power, we just use sharp words to pretend we still have teeth. Let us pause the frame, you and I, and look closely at this devastating dynamic. Luca believes she holds power, asking if this rare manuscript is a gift or an order. But watch the shadows shift across Vittorio's face. His voice drops, wrapping around the word request like a velvet noose. Inside that paper is the exact text she whispered the name of days ago. He did not just hear her. He catalogued her soul. The camera lingers on his eyes. There is no romantic warmth, only the cold patience of a hunter watching a steel trap snap shut on bone. It is beautifully, tragically twisted. Here is a brutal truth to remember. When someone hands you exactly what you have always dreamed of, you must always ask what piece of your soul it will cost to keep it. It is agonizing to watch this scene unfold. Luca attempts to regain control, her voice trembling slightly as she compares this lethal man to the pretentious art snobs back at her gallery. She dares to ask if he buys off every woman he kisses with an antique book, believing she has drawn an uncrossable line in the sand. But look at the dangerous shift in Vittorio's jaw. A ghost of a smirk dances on his lips. He leans closer, pulling every ounce of oxygen out of her lungs. She thought she was building a fortress, but she just handed him the blueprint to dismantle her. We all must learn this painful lesson eventually. Throwing fake bravery in the face of a true predator does not scare them away. It only serves to season the meat before the slaughter. This is the frame where cinematic irony shatters your heart. Vittorio gestures slowly toward her chest. She verbally rejects his offering, yet her fingers curl around that leather spine like a desperate mother protecting a child. She whispers hollow excuses, claiming it is purely literature. He allows her that fragile illusion, knowing it cements the cage. Then, the lighting cools. He calmly instructs her to wear a black dress, dropping the name Marchetti into the quiet room. He spins a terrifying narrative of a rival syndicate hunting her down, deliberately manufacturing a crisis. The tragedy holds a devastating lesson. Shared trauma, even when entirely fabricated by the architect of your pain, binds your soul to theirs much faster than joy ever could. Notice how the psychological manipulation turns devastating here. His voice is barely a whisper as he tells Luca the city is watching. She must play his property to survive. Hurt, she spits back that she is nothing but scenery. The camera pushes in as he softly corrects her, calling her his shield. It is a masterpiece of emotional warfare, making her feel profoundly valuable, while masking the brutal reality that shields are forged strictly to take damage. She swallows her pride, donning the dark dress and keeping her crooked glasses as a tiny badge of defiance. He simply watches the skyline, perfectly still. The lesson here is deeply chilling. The quietest person in the room is always the one you should fear most. They do not need to bark when they already own the cage. Step into this penthouse scene with me and feel the suffocating atmosphere. Vittorio radiates a terrifying stillness, a weight carried only by men who turn violence into art. Luca says she is ready, but Vittorio deliberately waits one agonizing beat before looking at her. It is a sickening tactic, training her subconscious to beg for his gaze. They descend into an armored vehicle, gliding through streets emptied by syndicate wealth. They arrive at a sterile restaurant to face the Marchetti matriarch, whose fingers are weighed down by antique blood money. Luca has no idea she has just stepped onto a fatal chessboard. Remember this crucial truth. The moment you enter someone else's carefully rigged game, you cease to be a human being and simply become a pawn. The camera tightens as the old matriarch instantly goes for the throat. She switches languages mid-sentence, a calculated test to fracture Luca's composure. Yet Luca holds her ground, fighting to project competence. This is the underlying tragedy. Beneath her fear, she is desperately trying to make Vittorio proud. Beside them sits Tommaso, whose ancient eyes catalog every micro-expression. Vittorio planted the seed of paranoia about him earlier. Tommaso leans forward, playing the fragile grandfather, rolling the syllables of Luca's name around his mouth, pretending his hearing is failing. Do not let the soft lighting fool you. The lesson is written in blood. We often mistake manners for kindness, but in a predator's world, politeness is merely a disguised lockpick. Tommaso performs the frail old man routine flawlessly, but watch the subtle terror in Luca's eyes. Before she answers, her gaze darts toward Vittorio. She registers his knuckles turning white around a wineglass, and her own shoulders instantly lock. She has completely synced her heartbeat to her captor's approval. Softly, she repeats her name, treating Tommaso like a confused elder. Suddenly, the matriarch laughs, shattering the icy tension, and asks Luca about manuscript restoration. A genuine, radiant smile breaks across Luca's face. She finally feels safely anchored in her passion. It is agonizing to witness. The devastating life lesson is clear. Humans are so starved to be understood that we will happily laugh and bond with the very monsters preparing our slaughter. Let us appreciate the dark irony unfolding at this dinner table. Luca snatches a linen napkin, moving with frantic passion to demonstrate ancient stitching techniques. She holds the city's most ruthless woman spellbound with tales of copper pigments, but she is hopelessly blind to the steel jaws closing around her. The camera pans to Vittorio. He has stopped eating, coldly calculating the exact financial advantage her brilliant mind can provide him. Beside him, Tommaso silently files away her every vulnerability. She genuinely believes she is winning this battle. The absolute, hardest truth you will ever learn is this: the exact moment you finally let your guard down and feel safe in a predator's house is the very second they figure out exactly how to break you. Deep within her mind, the sirens are wailing, but Luca desperately smothers the sound. She realizes she never mentioned her university at that table. Yet, when the matriarch brought it up, Vittorio's face remained carved from stone. He showed no surprise, having already exhumed every ghost of her past before they even met. The ride back is smothered in a heavy silence. Finally, Vittorio turns and tosses her a calculated crumb of validation, telling her she did well. The physical relief that washes over her is heartbreaking. She is utterly oblivious to the nightmare she is drowning in. It leaves us with a bitter lesson. Sometimes the very people who step up to shield us from the wolves are simply wolves themselves. Draped in a beautifully tailored suit, let us step into the dark intimacy of this moment together. The psychological warfare finally becomes physical. Inside the shadows of the car, Vittorio allows his knuckles to barely graze hers. Luca feels her pulse hammering, frantically building a wall of denial, blaming a bump in the road. She ignores the terrifying truth. A predator with his precision does absolutely nothing by accident. At her bedroom door, the tension becomes a living thing. He raises a hand, his skin pausing a millimeter from her trembling cheek. He lets that electric anticipation flood her nervous system, then simply turns his back. She collapses against the wood, gasping for air, sickened by the realization that she wanted him to enter. The lesson here is terrifying. The most inescapable prisons we ever inhabit are never forged from iron, but from our own desperate desires. The cruelest twist of this entire dynamic is that the violent crime syndicate no longer terrifies Luca. Her own internal cravings do. An entire week dissolves inside his golden cage, melting into a Sunday morning bathed in soft, deceptive light. Vittorio steps onto the balcony, shedding his lethal armor for a simple white shirt with rolled-up sleeves. It is a flawlessly manufactured display of vulnerability. He stands precisely close enough to invite intimacy, yet far enough away to cruelly deny it. In this horrific paradox, the architect of her nightmare becomes her only sanctuary. Here is a life lesson we must all wake up to. The true monsters of this world rarely kick down your door, bearing fangs. Most often, they arrive with rolled-up sleeves, leaning softly on a sunlit balcony, waiting patiently for you to willingly step right into their open jaws. The climax of this scene reveals absolutely everything about the nature of control. Vittorio casually leans against the iron railing, asking about her mother, deliberately dropping the word Philadelphia into the air. Luca feels the blood freezing in her veins. She knows she never told him where she was raised. Yet her fractured mind scrambles to protect the fragile illusion of safety, convincing herself she must have let it slip. The alternative is simply too horrifying to survive. Right there, she shatters. Weeping openly, she hands him the keys to her soul, detailing her father and that fatal crash. By surrendering her deepest agonies, she fastens her own psychological handcuffs. The lesson here is brutal. In our desperate search for a safe place to land, we will often hand our sharpest knives directly to our own executioners. Freeze the frame right here. What you are witnessing is a haunting display of psychological control. Vittorio offers 0 words of comfort, delivering no cheap apologies to fill the void. Instead, he deploys a suffocating silence designed to make Luca spill her darkest secrets. She bleeds out her grief, recounting her mother and those shattered dreams of the Amalfi Coast, picturing that lonely white chapel in Ravello. By silently absorbing her absolute tragedy, Vittorio transforms himself into the only vault capable of holding her pain. A master of manipulation does not need to raise his voice to own your soul. He simply listens. Here is the tragic lesson for you and me. True empathy helps carry the crushing weight of your sorrow, but weaponized silence only measures the depth of your wounds to see exactly where the blade will slide in easiest. Now, let the camera pan across the city to Zoe. She sits perfectly still, her eyes locked onto Giorgio, the imposing figure holding her fragile future in his hands. You think the world is vast and wide until you are trapped inside the inescapable gravity of a man like him. The dim lighting catches the sharp, unrelenting tension gripping his jaw, a physical reflection of his hidden criminal empire. Then, in a flash of calculated warmth, the monster vanishes. He drops his shoulders, flashes a flawless sideways smile, and plays the charming savior. "Drink your tea," he murmurs, and she obeys completely. He steps onto the balcony, while the Paris sky burns a violent pink behind the glass. You are watching a man wound so tight he might shatter at any moment. The ultimate tragedy of human nature is how eagerly we surrender to the monsters who remember to smile gently at us. Zoe completely misreads the energy in the room. She assumes Giorgio is merely exhausted, blind to the chilling reality that she is a pawn on his chessboard. Night falls, and she eats dinner in hollow isolation, while he locks himself away with Vincenzo. It is a deliberate tactic meant to make her feel small. She retreats to bed early, desperate to bury the ghost of Bastian, the man who previously broke her, but trauma refuses to fade in the dark. She wakes up violently, tearing at the sheets, a terrified scream caught in her throat. In her nightmare, Bastian is standing right inside her apartment. Her heart hammers relentlessly. Before the panic can fully set in, the door cracks open, and Giorgio speaks from the pitch-black corridor. The saddest truth in life is how often we trade one nightmare for another, foolishly believing the new shadow will keep us safe. "Company or silence?" he asks, his dark voice scraping against the quiet. Stick with me on this point, because this is the exact frame where the psychological trap snaps shut. By offering her the illusion of a choice, he pours a foundation of false safety. She swallows hard in the gloom, realizing he is waiting for her permission. "Silence," she whispers. The door clicks shut, but the lock never turns. She lies there wide awake. Hours later, she creeps across the freezing floorboards and presses her ear to the wood. He is still out there. She hears the rhythmic breathing of a dangerous man guarding her door without demanding a reward. She walks back to bed, falling completely into his hands. It is a tragic reality. The second a monster offers to become a shield, the victim begins writing a twisted romance just to survive the dark. Morning light cuts through the curtains, bringing a brutal reality into sharp focus. She opens her door and nearly steps on a fresh glass of water. Beside it rests a perfectly folded white handkerchief. This is definitely not a romantic gesture. It is the chilling proof of an apex predator predicting her exact emotional collapse. She stands completely frozen, paralyzed as an aching pressure builds behind her eyes. She mutters out loud that ruthless mobsters do not leave water because they care. They do it to protect their valuable investments. She repeats this 3 times to anchor her slipping sanity, but the awful truth bleeds right through. She does not believe her own lie anymore. The hardest lesson we ever have to learn is that sometimes the only hand treating you with gentleness belongs to the person engineering your ultimate destruction. She wanders into the dim shadows of the library, catching Giorgio changing his shirt. She freezes in her tracks, eyes locked onto a massive jagged scar ripping across his left shoulder. This is not the clean, measured work of a surgeon. This is a brutal bullet wound stitched together in panic inside some dark basement. Giorgio turns to face her, radiating a chilling, absolute calm. He knows exactly what holds her gaze. She stammers a quick apology, but he waves it away, buttoning his crisp shirt with the quiet precision of a killer. Before she can stop herself, she asks what happened. He does not even blink. Another life, he replies, burying his violent history like cold ash. It highlights a fatal human flaw. We constantly fall for people who hide their worst demons, convinced our love is the magic cure that will finally fix them. Giorgio executes an agonizing pause, staring her down over the dark rims of his reading glasses. For a fleeting second, she feels a twisted urge to laugh. Because they both wear crooked frames, the humor dies instantly in the cold air. Just that, he repeats, his voice dropping into a dark, commanding register. Zoe refuses to back away, knowing that taking a step back means total surrender. She meets his eyes and declares she is returning to work for Madame Aurielli on a manuscript. You will go with Vincenzo. He fires back like a whip. She argues she can repair old books without a bodyguard shadowing her. Giorgio's face turns to solid stone, his tone dead flat. I know, but you are not leaving without him. It is a deeply tragic scene. She actually believes she is fighting for her independence, entirely blind to the fact that she is already negotiating the terms of her own cage. She is trapped barely 2 feet away, completely pinned between his imposing frame and the towering wooden bookshelves. His physical presence is suffocating. He executes a slow, predatory scan of her face. His dark gaze checks her glasses, drops down to her parted lips, and finally locks onto her terrified eyes. Very well, she whispers, surrendering to his unyielding demand. Nobody moves an inch. The library falls so quiet you can hear his steady breaths, smelling of sharp bergamot and cold wealth. Then, with agonizing slowness, his right hand rises between them. He does not even touch her skin. He simply hovers his thumb in the empty air, tracing the fragile curve of her jawline. The most terrifying display of control is never a violent grip. It is the haunting promise that a monster can break you whenever they desire, but chooses to leave you waiting in the dark. Watch this carefully, because it shows how emotional warfare is won. She tilts her head up toward him. It is not the cabbage of her body giving up the fight. He closes the narrow gap, resting his heavy forehead against hers for 3 agonizing seconds. His warm breath hits her trembling lip, creating a moment of sheer psychological torture. His hand grips her waist over her clothes, not to enforce dominance, but to keep her from collapsing. Her breathing spirals into chaos. He shuts his eyes and whispers roughly in Italian. She only recognizes a single word, perdona, forgive me. Then he steps away. Just one tiny shift, but the emotional iron wall slams right back down between them. Vincenzo will take you Wednesday, he orders softly. 7 in the morning. This is the ultimate cruelty of a manipulator. They pull you close enough to feel their heartbeat, only to leave you freezing in the aftermath. Watch her bolt from the library, desperate to outrun her collapsing nervous system. She storms the hallway, slams her bedroom door, and presses her forehead against the cold wood. In her mind, she screams, fighting off the intoxicating delusion of romance. He does not want you. She repeats like a broken prayer. You are just an asset to protect. Predators do not fall in love. She claws at her sanity, but the tragedy is already in motion. Then, a low vibration hums through the heavy door. It is Giorgio. His slow breathing echoes on the other side, his weight leaning against her final line of defense. We can lie to our fragile minds all day long to survive, but when a monster waits patiently at your door, the heart is always the very first thing to surrender. You and I must look closely at the psychological warfare happening right here. Zoe knows he is out there in the dark. She does not need his shadow to feel the crushing weight of his presence. Watch the heavy brass doorknob shake. It's just a fraction of an inch. It moves solely from the terrifying pressure of his thumb against the metal. But he never turns it. He stands there, executing an agonizing mental siege. Finally, The tension snaps. The rhythmic thud of his boots slowly fades down the corridor. 2 agonizing days pass under a gray sky, and they avoid each other like wandering ghosts. The quietest moments in a house built on violence are always the absolute loudest. Silence is never merely empty space. Often, silence is the most brutal weapon a person can ever wield against you. Zoe is rapidly spiraling into a profound state of panic. She paces the floor, studying the armed guards outside, timing their patrols 3 separate times just to find a single blind spot. She frantically scribbles an escape plan in tiny letters, paranoid that she is losing her mind to this dark obsession. Then, the shrill ring of the phone shatters the quiet. Madame Aurieli is on the line, begging for help to appraise a rare French book. Zoe hangs up, knowing she must leave. But she is not running out that door for the simple love of old paper. She is fleeing the sickening attachment she is forming with a monster. As tragic as it is, we sometimes run headfirst into a burning fire, simply because we are deeply terrified of the terrible comfort we might find in the dark. Picture the opening frame of a heavy psychological thriller. The lighting is low, catching the damp skin of the man fresh from the shower. He stands there with his coat unfastened, consuming the room with the terrifying gravity of a true narcissist. Zoe catches his dark reflection in the glass, and instantly, her own identity fractures. She mentions the Lisbon collector, taking a job she knows will anger him, but he just coldly watches the rain streak the window. The silence between them stretches out, loaded and absolutely lethal. It is a painful truth of human nature that we so often hold our breath for the very people who would happily watch us drown. Remember this simple truth. You must never allow a monster's raging storm to dictate the weather inside your own soul. Let the camera pan to the street, framing the fragile illusion of safety. Vincenzo finally speaks, his voice flat and heavy like a Sicilian general drawing battle lines. "Return before the streetlights turn on," he orders. She tries to assert her independence, reminding him she is a grown woman, but he cuts her down with a freezing, dead-eyed stare. "You are my responsibility," he tells her. It sounds like salvation, but watch the subtle tightening of her jaw. He is not protecting her. He is just forging the bars of a prettier cage. She snatches her bag and hurries away, desperate to inhale the scent of decaying paper, just to feel alive. Here is the tragic reality. A golden cage is still a prison, and true freedom is nothing but a ghost, if you have to beg someone else to grant it to you. Outside the bookstore, the tension ratchets up a notch. Vincenzo paces the sidewalk, radiating pure mob paranoia. He parks his car facing the intersection, eyes scanning reflections in the glass, as he murmurs rapid Italian into his phone. Then, the camera lingers on the alley. A black sedan sits idling in the shadows. Any rational person would freeze, but watch her psychological defense mechanism activate. She forces her eyes away, pretending it is a simple coincidence. We all do this. We paint over the red flags because acknowledging the monster means our safe world is shattered, but turning your back on the shadow in the alley does not make the predator disappear. When your instinct screams that the dark is dangerous, you must trust yourself and listen. Notice how she buries herself in absolute denial. The menacing black sedan, idling outside, becomes just another piece of Parisian traffic in her mind. She steps into the muted sanctuary of the old bookshop, wrapping herself in the mundane. Aurélie stands behind the counter, complaining about a sore throat, grounding the scene in agonizing normalcy. The camera pushes close as our protagonist traces the fragile spine of a Portuguese manuscript. Her fingers move on muscle memory, building a fortress out of ink and parchment, while a violent storm gathers on her doorstep. We all use our daily routines as a shield against the things that terrify us. But busyness is just a paper wall. It will never stop the cold reality waiting outside your door. For one agonizingly beautiful beat, the tension lifts. Aurélie slides a porcelain teacup across the desk, making a sarcastic comment about the hitman and his expensive leather shoes on the pavement. It is perfect comedic relief to mask the creeping dread. The sinking sun floods the bookstore in rich cinematic gold, tricking your brain into thinking the danger has passed. Then, the deadbolt loudly snaps. Vincenzo shatters the quiet, a harsh guttural bark demanding she back away from the glass. The golden hour is dead, replaced by the cold blue light of a waking nightmare. It is a brutal reminder that the safest feeling moments in life are often just the deep breath before you go under. Peace is sometimes just a brief intermission for tragedy. The camera snaps to her terrified face, staring through the glass. 3 men storm the pavement, coats sweeping back to reveal cold steel. The trunk of their car yawns open like a waiting grave. In a typical thriller, this is where the heroine freezes. Instead, watch her break the mold. She screams for Aurelie to bolt the heavy iron door, turning the quiet shop into a battleground. She throws her entire weight against a massive oak bookcase, slowly. Then all at once, 20 years of leather-bound history cascades down onto the attackers in a deafening crash. It is a stunning display of desperate courage. When wolves arrive at your door, playing helpless prey guarantees a tragic end. To survive the monster, you must become the avalanche yourself. The frame erupts into sheer, disorienting chaos. Splintering oak, torn parchment, and shattered glass fill the air while Vincenzo barks desperate commands in Italian. Then, the horror gets intimately close. A heavy hand grips her ribs, yanking her backward by the hair. But look at the subtle shift in her expression. The panic vanishes, replaced by something ancient and feral. She channels every ounce of unresolved grief and sinks her teeth into the man's wrist like a cornered animal. She tastes copper. The attacker screams, stumbling away in shock. It is an ugly, visceral, and absolutely necessary victory. It teaches us a grim truth about the darker side of humanity. You cannot negotiate with a relentless predator. True boundaries are always carved in blood. The attacker thrashes wildly, hurling her against the cold stone floor. Her skin scrapes raw against the masonry. Her glasses shatter, and the camera lens blurs to distort the terrible violence around her. Through this dizzying haze, Vincenzo executes one of the men in 2 blinding, ruthless seconds. Then, the true architect of the nightmare arrives. Giorgio's car tears down the narrow street, defying every law, because he practically owns the asphalt. Notice his entrance. He does not run to save her. He steps out, slow and deliberate, carrying the chilling, inevitable gravity of a reaper. It is a haunting image that proves a hard point. Real, terrifying power never needs to sprint. It simply takes its time, fully aware that you have absolutely nowhere left to run. Watch closely as the director frames absolute dominance. Giorgio approaches the trembling survivor. Without a shift in his cold expression, he grabs the man's arm and snaps it backward. The hollow crack echoes above the police sirens in the distance. Giorgio crouches, his voice a flat, dead calm. In flawless French, he commands the weeping man to deliver a message to a rival named Lefra. He turns a broken human being into a bloody, living telegram. The camera slowly pans over her shoulder, revealing the other attacker staring blindly at the ceiling, lifeless. This is the horrifying reality of the underworld we must understand. For cruel men like Giorgio, inflicting pain is never a loss of control. It is just their native language, spoken with terrifying fluency. The most unsettling detail here is the dead silence that crashes down after the violence. No flashing sirens, no panicked neighbors, just a chillingly efficient cleanup. Her body convulses, the adrenaline draining from her veins like cold water. Aurelie gathers the trembling girl into the wreckage, whispering fierce words of survival. In the background, Giorgio murmurs, in casual Italian, as if discussing the weather. Then the boss steps forward. His face is a mask of marble as he gently brushes the blood from her bruised lip. You and I need to pay close attention to this frame. This is the genesis of a psychological trap. It teaches us a brutal life lesson. We let the devil play the savior, mistakenly trading a fleeting second of mercy for the heavy chains of a trauma bond. Focus on the absolute iron will of Aurelie. This weary shop owner refuses to crumble into hysterics. Looking past the shattered glass, she stares into the trembling girl and asks one question. Did you bite him? The girl nods, and a silent pact forms in the dust. She has teeth. She will survive this. Arali then turns her attention to the Mafia kingpin. Giorgio stands amid the ruin, his suit stained, radiating the violence of a coiled snake. Yet, the older woman does not blink. They lock eyes in a wordless war for dominance. It paints a stunning visual metaphor, leading to a profound life lesson. The most dangerous presence in any room is rarely the one holding the weapon. It is the person who stands perfectly still while the world burns around them. Arali is immune to the magnetic gravity of this criminal. With the steady tone of someone scolding a careless student, she demands to know if he brought this chaos to her sanctuary. Giorgio remains silent, offering a grim confirmation from the shadows. Unfazed, Arali firmly orders him to tend to the terrified girl. Astonishingly, the untouchable kingpin blinks first. He yields to her authority, commanding his men out to the street. The scene cuts sharply to the freezing isolation of his penthouse. The girl sits there, trembling uncontrollably beneath the expensive lights. It brings us to a devastating reality and a harsh life lesson. You can lock the heavy doors and hide behind millions of dollars, but your physical body never forgets the sheer terror of the dark. In the suffocating quiet of the apartment, she sits detached, staring at her shaking hands as if they belong to a stranger. Giorgio dismisses his guards, sealing them inside this glass vault. He approaches with the careful grace of a predator, sinking to his knees in a flawless display of manufactured vulnerability. The camera pushes in close, but here is the magnificent twist. She does not break. Instead of falling into his arms, she recoils, pressing her spine into the sofa to escape his touch. The polite facade shatters. She looks him dead in the eye and tells him he is not a good man. Let us celebrate this victory, because it holds a powerful life lesson. The exact second you stop accepting a fake apology is the moment you reclaim your soul. Look closely at this frame. The shadows stretch sharp across her trembling shoulders as she throws the raw truth into his face. She forces him to recall the sickening crack of a snapping bone, refusing to let him paint his brutality as a dark romance. She lays bare 10 years of surviving pure hell. Her night terrors taught her the language of violence perfectly, but Giorgio does not blink. Instead, he weaponizes his own surrender. He stays on his knees, his voice an eerie calm, swearing to remain anchored to the floor until she commands him to rise. Giving someone a fake sense of power is merely a way to lock a psychological cage from the inside. It leaves us with a haunting life lesson. Sometimes, the most deadly traps in life look exactly like wide-open doors. The camera lingers on her hands while her mind tears itself apart. Minutes ago, those fingers possessed the strength to draw blood from a killer. Now, they tremble as she looks down at a powerful man playing the role of the weak. Her rage twists into something far more fatal. She whispers a breathless word for him to stay. Giorgio remains frozen on the carpet, his tailored suit stained with the crimson of his true nature. Slowly, he removes her shattered glasses, forcing her to meet his eyes without a shield. Then, he quietly asks if he can touch her. We must recognize a brutal life lesson here. The second a monster stops demanding and starts asking for permission, we instinctively drop our swords. False respect disarms us faster than any weapon. The tragedy unfolds exactly as we fear. She gives him consent without putting up a fight. It is heartbreaking to watch her shoulders cave in, but no one could blame her. When you spend your life flinching from a raised fist, a gentle hand feels like a miracle, even if it just finished tearing someone else apart. She offers a slow nod, and in that agonizing split second, the dark, power dynamic between them is cast in stone. He did not breach her walls by force. He merely waited until she willingly handed over the keys. This paints a devastating picture of human frailty. The clear life lesson here is that extreme emotional exhaustion forces us to settle for anything resembling peace, regardless of how deeply toxic the source of that comfort might be. Stick with me as the camera focuses on her fractured psyche. She stares down at Giorgio, kneeling on the floorboards while another man's blood soaks into his silk sleeve. He offers a carefully crafted apology, playing the vulnerable card with cinematic perfection. In response, she replies with an empty voice, listing the agonizing years her life was shattered. Her former abuser never needed fists, choosing to torture her mind every day instead. Yet, she looks at Giorgio and admits a terrifying truth. No man has ever used violence to protect her before. Right there, the dark roots of a trauma bond permanently take hold. It offers a harsh, tragic life lesson. Our deepest unhealed wounds leave us so utterly desperate for a protector that we will willingly embrace a lethal predator. She reaches out, pressing trembling fingers against his wrist. Feeling his steady pulse is a terrifying detail, proving how ordinary this violent chaos is to him. Her exhausted mind spins excuses for his brutality, desperate to convince her battered soul that the bloodshed was a twisted form of chivalry. We are watching a victim paint a predator as a savior. Giorgio murmurs that she owes him nothing, an insidious trick designed to ensure she feels indebted forever. She surrenders, resting her forehead against his until their breathing aligns. His hand wraps around the nape of her neck, quietly claiming his territory. A vital life lesson echoes in this dark illusion. We so often dangerously confuse the temporary absence of pain with genuine, lasting safety. Notice how the massive penthouse suddenly shrinks into a suffocating box. The psychological trap finally snaps shut around her mind. Giorgio speaks first, expertly weaponizing her hesitation. He claims she deserves to know who he really is, dressing his dark confession as emotional vulnerability. Still kneeling, he uses physical surrender to hide that he pulls every string. He drops the bomb in a quiet voice, admitting he has run a ruthless crime family since the age of 28. He feeds her calculated truths to keep her blind to the terrifying bigger picture. By pointing out her shaking hands, he plays the merciful king, offering false grace. The life lesson in this tragedy is simple. Manipulators will always offer a warm, comforting lie in exchange for stealing your bitter truth. Let us pause on this frame together, because we are watching the exact moment the trap locks. Giorgio invents a new danger just so he can play the savior, swearing on his scar to protect her. It is calculated theater, meant to break her independence. When she asks why he cares, her exhausted voice trembles, aching for warmth. He flashes a cold smirk and says it is because she threw herself at his mercy. Her spirit is so battered she misses the danger, twisting his cruelty into something holy, like a sacred vow spoken in a dark cathedral. It is agonizing to witness, but it brings us to a harsh life lesson. When a person is truly starving for just one drop of safety, they will stare directly at the iron bars of a cage and convince themselves it is a loving embrace. Watch the revealing body language here. She reaches out to him first, driven by a tragic urge to keep the monster pacified. He takes her hand with a terrifying finality, sealing their silent bargain. Standing in the shadows, she cups his face. She feels the rough stubble on his jaw, resting her exhausted forehead against his. In that single breath, the natural survival instinct that kept her alive simply washes away. She whispers that she knows he is lying, but her tone is completely hollow. Giorgio closes his eyes, his face a flawless mask of stone. She stares at him, using his physical beauty to excuse the ruthless killer hiding beneath the skin. It leaves us with a bitter, undeniable life lesson. Deeply frightened people will almost always choose a beautiful, comforting lie over a cold and terrifying truth. Let us examine this closely. By rejecting the truth, Zoe hands Giorgio the nails to build her own cage. It is a twisted survival instinct. Giorgio exhales a fragile breath, faking weakness so she feels needed. But when he leans in for the kiss, watch the screen. There is zero warmth. It is cold and calculated to break her down. Notice his hand sliding to the back of her neck. It mimics affection, yet it is pure ownership. He strokes her cheek, mapping out the ground she has surrendered. She allows this, giving him permission to take everything she has left. This leaves us with a grim life lesson. The absolute best way to control a person is to make them believe they were the ones who chose to hand over the keys. Watch the exact frame where her freedom shatters. The camera pushes in tightly, as Giorgio pulls back, his dark eyes locking onto hers. She has no glasses to hide behind anymore. He whispers for her to follow him. It is just one quiet command. Her hand trembles slightly as it slips into his grip. He guides her down the very hallway she spent weeks pacing and trying to control. Now she surrenders every inch. The heavy thud of his shoulder hitting the light switch plunges the shot into total blackness. A harsh cut follows to the morning, where soft sunlight washes over white sheets, painting an illusion of peace over an irreversible tragedy. The hardest truth to accept in life is that our own minds will eagerly decorate the walls of a cage, just to avoid admitting we are trapped. The lens finds Zoe waking up, the morning light feeling heavy and cold. The room is permanently stained by his presence. His dark shirt is draped over a chair, and her glasses sit folded on the nightstand with an eerie precision, muffled through the thick plaster. His low voice snaps brutal orders in Italian. It is a sharp audio cue that she is resting inside a killer's den. And yet, a slow, tragic smile breaks across her lips. For the first time in 10 years, she actually slept through the night. By surrendering to the biggest monster in the room, her exhausted nerves finally felt safe. It reveals a highly uncomfortable truth about human nature. A broken soul will willingly wrap its arms around the devil if it means they can finally stop running from their own shadows. Study her body language in this frame. Zoe draws a shallow breath, shrinking down into the posture of the little girl who lost her father. That unhealed grief makes her the perfect mark for a false savior. She rubs her arms, trying to anchor herself. Then, without a single creak, the bedroom door swings open. Giorgio walks in holding steaming coffee. He looks exactly like a romantic lead, wearing dark trousers and a loose white shirt, his hair dripping wet. It is a flawless cinematic disguise, using domestic warmth to completely wash away his violent history. We must never forget this simple life lesson. True danger rarely announces itself with loud footsteps or obvious threats. More often than not, it walks right into your life, offering a gentle smile and a warm cup of coffee. Let us freeze the frame right here and study Giorgio in that shadowy doorway. The dim morning light catches his face as he plays the ultimate megalomaniac, making Zoe feel entirely chosen. He hands her the coffee, steaming in the cool air, crafted with terrifying precision. It has the exact ratio of cream she orders at her local bakery. When she asks how he knew, his calm admission should terrify her. He watched her for days, memorizing her life. If you and I heard that, we would run for the door. Yet Zoe just smiles, sipping the warm poison, sealing herself inside his beautiful trap. Here is the tragic truth we must carry with us. Obsession loves to disguise itself as profound devotion. And we rarely see the wolf until we are already securely locked inside the cage. Notice how the camera lingers on the rare book resting between them on the bed. It acts as a physical apology, a heavy anchor of manipulation that she accepts like a sacred gift. It is agonizing to watch him smoothly overwrite her reality. In a low murmur, he mentions erasing her schedule, and she blindly surrenders her freedom. The lighting shifts as he brings up Bastian, claiming he neutralized the threat. He spins a dark fairy tale of being her noble shield, hiding the sickening fact that he is the true monster in the room. The ultimate tragedy is the devotion in her eyes as she believes him. We must learn from this quiet horror. When a soul is starved for safety, they will happily warm their hands on the very fire that is burning their entire world to the ground. Giorgio whispers for her to rest, masterfully pulling the strings of this twisted tragedy. Seeking a breath of normal air, Zoe attempts a fragile joke about avoiding marriage, desperately trying to cut the suffocating tension. Giorgio offers a shadow-soaked smile, humoring her while maintaining absolute dominance. He agrees to hold off on marriage, granting her the pathetic illusion that she still has boundaries. His voice is smooth as glass when he claims he only makes small promises because he keeps them. It is a terrifying masterclass in fake humility. Drowning in this manufactured safety, she leans forward to kiss his shoulder. A haunting life lesson echoes in this room. Trust built in the shadow of complete terror is never really trust at all. It is just a desperate heart, doing whatever it takes to survive the night. He rests his chin against her hair, breathing her in as if he owns the very air she exhales. The scene cuts to the freezing marble of the penthouse kitchen. Zoe wanders in wearing his oversized dress shirt, appearing entirely swallowed by his identity. Giorgio follows like a quiet predator, dropping a heavy, possessive hand onto her waist. The speed of his ownership is terrifying, yet to Zoe it feels like a warm embrace. The camera catches Vincenzo, the brutal enforcer, casually reading a morning paper. The visual contrast is absurd. Barefoot and delicate, Zoe is happily playing house inside a fortified crime compound. Let this be a painful reminder. Normalizing the abnormal is a dangerous game, one that slowly blinds your survival instincts. Until you are comfortably sleeping inside a tiger cage, let us pan across this room. Vincenzo lifts his gaze, his face a dead-eyed mask. He addresses Giorgio formally as the Don, a chilling reminder of the blood on their hands. Giorgio fires back in rapid Italian, sounding perfectly relaxed. Zoe understands none of it, yet she happily soaks in the golden morning light. Vincenzo shoots her a microscopic smile, wishes her a good morning in French, and gestures to the fresh bread. Then comes a sound that breaks your heart. Zoe actually laughs. It is a breathless, genuine sound of pure joy. She is entirely assimilated, finding true comfort among men who could destroy her in a heartbeat. It leaves us with a haunting realization. The darkest places on Earth are fully capable of constructing the most beautiful illusions of a safe home. Watch her bathed in sunlight, sitting in this temporary sanctuary. She hugs his shirt tightly, hiding inside the monster's shadow to feel safe. Giorgio leans nearby, radiating manufactured domestic peace. Suddenly, the camera pushes in tight on her eyes. The grand illusion finally cracks. Her mind violently flashes back to the claustrophobic elevator on their first day together. Before she ever mentioned the stalker, Giorgio had calmly spoken Bastien Lev's full name. He already knew the target. He orchestrated the entire threat. It is agonizing to watch her realize she was a pawn from the very first minute. You and I have likely felt this devastating pain before. Our fragile minds will desperately bury the most terrifying warnings just to keep an exhausted heart from shattering entirely. Study her silent grief right here. She slowly lowers her coffee, her gaze burning into the side of Giorgio's face. He plays the ultimate protector flawlessly, tracing hypnotic circles on her back to cement their trauma bond. For 2 agonizing seconds, the horrifying truth that he orchestrated her misery burns on her tongue. Yet, she swallows the words. We scream at the screen, begging her to run. Why does she stay quiet? Because she finally feels happy, and to a broken soul, sudden happiness is deeply terrifying. It gives you something to lose. She locks the betrayal away in a mental vault. We all make this tragic mistake, choosing a beautiful lie over a brutal reality. Always remember this simple lesson. The human body keeps the score, and it will never truly forgive a forced deception. She takes that glowing red flag and buries it in the dark archives of her mind. The scene looks like domestic bliss, but beneath the surface, it is an exhausting sea of hypervigilance. Giorgio possesses the dark instincts of a veteran sociopath. He feels the microscopic shift in her breathing. Turning his head, he softly asks if everything is all right. The lighting cools. It is a lethal pop quiz testing her loyalty. She lies directly to his face, sealing her fate by pressing a tender kiss to his shoulder. He rewards her submission with a gentle kiss on her hair. It is operant conditioning, executed flawlessly as the morning sun rises. This bitter scene highlights a crucial life truth. Real safety can never exist in the arms of a person you must carefully manage just to survive the day. Stick with me, because the second act of this story is where the trap finally snaps shut. 3 weeks of quiet routine was all it took for her to drop her guard. She drank the coffee he poured and allowed him to soothe her fears, truly believing he was her savior. But there is a bitter reality we have to face. Controlling people do not rescue those who are hurting. They collect them, hoarding them like stolen art. The man she thought was her safe harbor was the storm she should have run from. It hurts to watch someone sink into a carefully crafted lie. Still, it leaves us with a quiet lesson for our own lives. The most dangerous cage is never made of cold iron bars. It is built from comforting words and warm blankets, making you forget you even need to escape. Her reality shatters when a simple piece of paper destroys her denial. A photograph slips out of the book he gave her. Picture the camera pushing in on the image. It is Zoe at 16, smiling in the bright sunlight of her graduation. But lingering in the blurred background across the street is a younger Giorgio. He had been tracking his prize for years. The handwritten words on the back are a sickening promise of her eternal debt. Her hands turn to ice. You can feel her heart giving out under the crushing weight of this betrayal. The romantic fairy tale instantly burns to ash, leaving only terror. It brings us to a deeply human truth we must all remember. You can never truly heal your broken soul in the exact same toxic soil that caused you to bleed in the first place.
Giorgio's tenderness slowly makes Zoe feel safe. He gives her books, remembers how she takes coffee, waits outside her door after a nightmare, and treats her with the gentleness she has rarely known. These moments then feel intimate and meaningful because they are quiet and not dramatic. However, the ending of the file reveals a darker lesson. Tenderness becomes dangerous when it hides a larger truth. Zoe later discovers that Giorgio may have known her the long before the elevator, and that the rescue may not have been accidental at all. The photograph of her at 16 suggests that her connection to him is tied to a debt, a plan, or a history she never consented to enter. This creates an important educational message. Emotional care does not replace honesty. A person can be gentle and still manipulative. A person can make you feel seen and still be hiding information that changes everything. Zoe's pain comes not only from fear, but from the possibility that the safety she does trust was part of a strategy. In real life, people often confuse tenderness with truth. Someone may remember your preferences and comfort you after nightmares and speak softly, but if they hide facts that affect your freedom, trust becomes fragile. The story teaches that love must be built on transparency, not carefully managed ignorance. Giorgio truly care for Zoe, but if he brought her into the world under false circumstances, then his care is incomplete. The lesson for viewers is clear. Do not ignore unanswered questions simply because someone makes you feel safe. Safety built on secrets can collapse quickly. Real love tells the truth before the truth becomes a weapon.